Everybody to the call of the TGDC. Can you hear me okay? Audio is working well?
Yes, I can. This is Jerome.
Right. Wonderful, thanks. Yes. Very good. Well, once again, welcome to our TGDC meeting. It's 18th of December. We have to continue to move our agenda. I'm Walt Copan, the Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and Director of NIST. And I'm glad to be with you today at our meeting, which we're holding in accordance with the Help America Vote Act. And so as Director of NIST, I'm honored to serve as the chair of the TGDC, our Technical Guidelines Development Committee. And on behalf of the Election Assistance Commission, designated federal officer for TGDC, Commissioner Ben Hovland, and NIST, welcome again to this follow-on WebEx meeting and audio conference to continue our review and discussion of the requirements of the voluntary voting. During the November meeting that we held, the TGDC asked for a review of the definition of the voting system and consideration of how the proposed security requirements apply to E-pollbooks, the transmission of unofficial results, and remote ballot marking. NIST has examined the voting system definitions in all previous versions of the VVSG and has taken into account consideration of the voting system definition in the Help America Vote Act. So John Wack is going to present the evolution of this definition and suggested changes. As also suggested by the TGDC, NIST has reached out to voting system manufacturers and e-pollbook vendors to get a sense of their currently deployed hybrid solutions, as well as additional states that were seeking similar solutions. And so we examined what was available, those solutions including cellular, cable, identified associate threat, discussed potential mitigations. Emma Howell, who's on our call today, will present our. And finally, time permitting, we'll discuss ballot marking and the minor updates that were made to the provisional standards process that we discussed last time, as well as the public comment process documents. So by the end of today's meeting, I am very hopeful that we'll have agreement on the primary security requirements within VVSG. We'll be able to identify our remaining details that are necessary to move forward towards a TGDC vote in January. So again, thanks for being on the call, for the important steps that you'll take toward finalizing VVSG 2.0 recommendations during this meeting. And I'd like to turn it over now to Commissioner Ben Hovland for his introductory remarks and to kick off our proceedings. Thanks. Ben?
Thank you, Dr. Copan. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. My name is Ben Hovland, Commissioner of the Election Assistance Commission and the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, or TGDC. The TGDC is a 15-member advisory committee established by the Help America Vote Act to assist the Election Assistance Commission in developing the voluntary voting system guidelines. Pursuant to HAVA, the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology serves as the chair of the TGDC, and want to thank Dr. Copan again for his participation and being here today. This meeting was called pursuant to the Federal Advisory Committee Act and has been noticed in the Federal Register and published on the EAC website for today's meeting. The meeting is open to the public. As Dr. Copan mentioned, the discussion today will continue our conversation around the voluntary voting system guideline requirements that are currently being drafted by NIST. As was mentioned in the email, we know that a number of members were not necessarily able to join us today, and so we are recording this and it will be available to them, both from people chiming in earlier and looking through. I have taken a rough sense of the participants, so I'm going to expedite that and skip the roll, knowing that, again, we aren't voting today and or that others will be joining this on the recording. But again, as Dr. Copan said, I really believe that our goal and hope out of this is to move to identify a path to voting in early January, and look forward to that. So thank you, and look forward to the presentations. Thank you all for joining us today.
Very good. At this time, let me turn it over to Mary Brady to kick us off.
Thanks, Dr. Copen. I think we have two primary items on the agenda, and the first is a review of the voting system definition that John Wack will go through. We have a series of slides that outline the history of the definition of a voting system and some recommendations. And then following that, we have Gemma Howell, who will go over, has slides that are fairly much, pretty much equivalent to what you received in the document on network considerations, and she'll go over the work that we've done in examining network requirements and, looking at deployed systems, looking at threats, and some recommendations on our network requirements. So with that, John Wack, just a minute here while we move laptops around.
Hello, everybody out there. As always, it's a pleasure to get to present to you. Oh, and you even get to look at my face. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Okay. I am trying to figure out how to bring up PowerPoint up here. There we go.
There we go.
Okay. Now let me put this into, there we go. Okay. All right, so at the last meeting, a couple of questions were raised about the voting system definition that we're using for 2.0. And so we thought it was a good idea just to talk in general about the different definitions over the years and where they came from. So, first of all, why do we even care about it? Well, in a sense, HAVA's definition defines the scope of the whole effort. It really says a voting system has to be at least this. And one of the reasons that we think it's very important is that if defined well, if defined in terms of functions as opposed to specific equipment, then we're allowing the marketplace to innovate and satisfy things as the marketplace best determines its customers want. So we want everybody to be on the same page with the definition. We want it to be stated in clear, plain language, and we do not want to deviate from the scope of HAVA at this particular point. So the original HAVA definition does a pretty good job of sticking to functions. We had over the years some issues with making it or putting it into plain language, but it defines, essentially the basic set of pre-election, election, post-election functions. And I don't need to read through the whole definition. It's stated in terms of two clauses, with defining ballots, casting, counting votes, so on and so forth. And then it goes on into the second clause, identify system components and versions of such components. Some of that you can see we could state it perhaps a little more briefly, a little more generally, and a little more in terms of functions, general functions. So when the first VVSG was written, it didn't really change the language. It really kind of combined it into one sentence, but it really didn't make changes there. 1.1, the same thing. 1.1 was not intended to be any sort of a major update, and it did add one particular clause about including automatic barcode readers. So it's 2007. The 2007 VVSG recommendations where some effort.
Sorry, hey John.
Yes.
I'm not seeing the slides on the screen.
Oh, that's entirely my fault. Okay. Now are you seeing them?
No, not yet. Still just seeing you.
Are others having that issue?
Yes.
Yeah, I just see your face.
Lucky.
Well,
Not a bad face.
well, thank you. At least someone feels that way. Okay,
Can you guys see our desktop now?
No, still just the camera view.
Sorry for 1 second, everybody.
If you go a little bit further, does it give you options for sharing?
Should be at the bottom of the screen.
How about that?
Yeah.
They just came up.
Okay, great. Okay, just briefly, you've missed the HAVA definition in the slides, and I talked about 1.0 and 1.1, not changing that. So we've gotten to the 2007 VVSG, and for that effort, we worked with some people who were plain language experts, and our desire there, again, was to state these things that a voting system needs to do in terms of more general functions and not, as much as possible to avoid getting into any specific language about certain types of devices. So we came up with a definition that is very, very similar to the HAVA definition that does not limit or broaden the definition, but it states things more in terms of general activities of a voting system. I think HAVA had some words in it such as equipment. I think HAVA described equipment as being electromechanical. We don't use that word. And, there are some other things in here. So when we got to this current standard that we're working on, as always, we started back with HAVA and looked at 1.0 and 1.1. And we know that a significant effort was put in for the 2007 VVSG to state it more clearly in a way that the marketplace would like, but that is still accurate. And we made a few more changes to improve the definition's clarity of scope. And we still think it's very much in line with HAVA and the 2007 definition. So here I have the the VVSG 2.0 definition, very similar to the 2000. Those parts that are in bold and italics, just keep those in mind because those are items that we changed in the current definition we have. But you see those as activate ballots, capture votes, reconcile, transmit election data, audit elections. Again, as much as possible, we're trying to make all requirements in 2.0 pretty much say as their scope, it is this definition, the voting system here. And, we don't care how the requirement is satisfied by any particular device, it just needs to be satisfied by that voting system. So we thought that some changes to some of the terminology would improve that. So our current definition is as follows, and in my opinion, one major improvement there is just the fact that we used a numbered list as opposed to one big paragraph. So that's a few things. We had some input from a state audit working group, some good comments as well as comments elsewhere in our own research, and we wanted to make a few things more clear. Activate ballots for voters, record votes cast by voters. Instead of reconcile ballots, voting system actually needs to label them so that election officials can do their reconciliation. The previous definition said transmit election data, and transmit might cause some people to think, we're talking about a network sort of electronic means. We don't want to imply that. We just want to say export election data. And then lastly, produce records in support of audits as opposed to audit elections. Election officials and others audit elections. The voting system needs to produce records that will support these sorts of audits. So there we are. And are there any questions?
This is Paul in Florida. I'm good, John. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
If others are, then let me turn it back over to Mary.
Well, you can turn it over to me briefly, but then I'm going to pivot and turn it directly over to Gemma Howell. You are.
Okay.
All right.
Just a minute here. We're actually in different locations, so we're making good use of technology today. Gemma is in California, and Ben will be will be moving the slides on behalf of Gemma.
Hi, everybody.
Gemma, are you there?
Yep. Sorry, just getting off mute. I'm all set, and thank you, Ben, for pretending to be me on the video con. And okay, we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Gemma Howell. Everyone's familiar with me. I'm a security engineer leading the security work on the voting team at NIST. You can go ahead to the next slide. Here's the agenda. It just gives a brief overview of what we'll talk about today, the methodology that we've taken since our last call, a brief overview of the vendor discussions, and then we've broken out the major discussion into two big sections. The first one being external network communications across public networks, including the internet, and then internal wireless communications between devices within the polling place. Next slide. All right, this methodology slide is basically giving an overview of what we've been up to since our last meeting. Per the request of the TGDC, we reached out to the vendors and I'll go over that discussion in the next slide. We've also identified the specific use cases for those two big areas, external public network connections and then internal wireless communications. We looked into the different types of technology used to accomplish those use cases. Also reviewed the concerns and potential threats to the voting system with the specific use cases and how the technology is used within those devices. And then we address those concerns by our recommendations, and then finally pointing to the relevant VVSG 2.0 requirements that actually address those prior mentioned concerns. Next slide. All right, so as was mentioned earlier, we were able to speak to voting system vendors and e-pollbook vendors. And what we did was we shared some of our initial research findings. So we had already gathered a list of use cases, concerns, and developed the current VVSG requirements, and we shared those with those vendors. After those were shared, we got into a discussion about, are these use cases accurate? Are there any use cases that we're missing? And are there any concerns about the current VVSG requirements and how the requirements might impact these use cases? And what we found was that the use cases were accurate, but we did get a little more insight into the specifics of the technology that might be used to accomplish these specific use cases, which were very helpful. And one concern that came up was that vendors receive requests for a built-in cellular modem capability to transmit election results. And one of the requirements might impact that request. Now, while they shared the states that specifically request this capability, we have not gone back to confirm with these states that they are actually still requesting this capability if they still need it. So no confirmation has been done on the state side. This is just information received from the vendor. Next slide. Okay, next we're going to jump into external network communications. And that is going to be covered under two main use cases that were defined through our discussions. And that is e-pollbooks that are used to activate the ballot and the transmission of election results. Next slide. This slide here gives an overview about what e-pollbooks are. So they're vote registry devices that are used to check in voters and provide them with the correct ballot, also known as ballot activation. These e-pollbooks often connect to external networks to receive updates from the voter registration databases, and these databases may be hosted in the cloud, or you have to reach those voter registration databases by traversing the internet to actually get to them. Another thing that we want to mention here are the ballot on demand devices, which print out a voter's ballot with the appropriate style. These devices may be integrated with a networked e-pollbook, so they receive the information directly from an e-pollbook, and that's how they know what's the appropriate ballot to print. We've also heard that these devices may also receive that information directly from the voter registration database. And then lastly here, a ballot marking device may be connected to an e-pollbook. And so the e-pollbook would send the information directly to a ballot marking device to present the voter with the correct ballot to begin marking their ballot. Next slide. Okay, on this side, we have a diagram to show those e-pollbook scenarios that I just described. So right there with the red arrows, you'll see an e-pollbook receiving updates from the voter registration database, which, as I mentioned, those voter registration databases are often hosted in the cloud, or you have to traverse the internet to actually get to those voter registration databases. And that connection is to get updates to the e-pollbook. Excuse me. And then that same e-pollbook in this diagram is directly connected to a ballot on demand device that, as I mentioned, prints the correct ballot, and is also could be connected to a ballot marking device, as I mentioned as well. So you'll see direct connections from the e-pollbook to the ballot on demand device, and direct connections from the e-pollbook to a ballot marking device. And then finally, the diagram also shows the scenario that I mentioned where a ballot on demand receives the voter's ballot information directly from the voter registration database. Next. So these connections can happen over the following mediums. So it could be a cellular modem or just a cellular capability that might be within one of these e-pollbooks. An e-pollbook may be an iPad that has cellular capability and is able to reach out to the internet that way. Next. Or it could plug in physically to a cable modem. Think of something like Fios or Comcast here. Next. Or it might leverage the telephone network and may use something like a dial-up modem. Next slide. All right, this slide here is describing the transmission of election results use case. So once the polls close, a polling place or precinct may aggregate and send election results to the jurisdiction's central count location or state election center. We also found that historically, electronic transmission has occurred maybe by placing a DRE or an optical scanner in tabulator mode, aggregating the results, and then transmitting over that same cellular cable or dial-up modem that I mentioned earlier. But certainly there is also that physical transport or that sneaker net process that could also be used to transmit election results manually. Next slide. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're focusing on that electronic transmission. So now on this slide, there is a diagram that shows a scanner / tabulator / DRE that's connecting directly, that's connecting to an external network to send the election results across the internet to that central count or state election center. Next. And so this transmission can be done through means similar to E-pollbooks. So a USB cellular modem may plug directly into the scanner or tabulator, and that cellular modem would then reach out to the cellular network to transmit the election results across the internet that way. And then next, and you can go ahead and next again, Ben. And then, as I mentioned before, similar to the E-pollbooks, a scanner or tabulator could plug directly into a wall and tap into that cable modem or dial-up modem. Next. All right, this slide gives a very brief overview of the technology that I've mentioned. So that cellular network transmission, as I just mentioned, could be done over a USB modem. And once these are booted, they are trying to connect to a cellular network and send data. And so they're looking for the node that they want to send information to. And that connection is maintained while powered on. Often these devices, these USB modems are considered cost devices. They're hardware, software, they're not developed by the vendor, and so they're not usually subject to source code review or any other software analysis by a VISTL for certification. And then cable modems, as I mentioned before, this is similar to Comcast or a Verizon modem. These are wired connections that hook straight up to the tabulator or scanner. And again, these are always on connections, and they expose the device to many other devices and users on the internet, because at that point, you just become another node on the internet along with everyone else. Then lastly, here we have dial-up modems. Originally, these telephone networks were fixed analog systems, but today they may be digital or maybe some type of mixture of digital and analog. And many of these networks and typically traverse different networks, including the internet, maybe even touching the cellular network and going over the cellular network as well. Next slide. So what are we worried about? The concerns and potential threats here are specific to that physical connection between devices communicating over the internet and the voting system. So in the case of the scanner or tabulator, there's a USB, a cellular modem USB directly inserted into that tabulator. In the other cases of a cable modem or a dial-up, there are lines that are directly connected to that scanner or tabulator. And this connection provides, as I mentioned, they make the voting system a node on the internet, but it also could potentially provide an entryway for remote attackers. And not just close-range remote attackers. Once you're on the internet, now even further nation-state attackers may have access to you. And what's the impact of that? It could cause a loss of confidentiality and integrity of the voting system and that information that's on the voting system. If you're able to listen to the information as it's traveling across the internet, you're compromising the confidentiality. If you're able to inject malware into the voting system, now you can change the data. Now you can change the information that's within the voting system, or change the behavior of the voting system itself. And then finally, loss of availability to access data or perform election processes. I think many of us are familiar with ransomware attacks and how they lock down your computer from being able to be used or do anything until that ransom is paid. Next. And here I just share one more additional example from the cellular side. It takes a lot to know what type of cellular network is being used within your voting system. And even so, there is this rogue base station scenario where someone may be sitting outside or near a polling location and impersonating a cellular network. And if they have enough information to impersonate a cellular network that your modem might be looking for when it's trying to broadcast and reach out, then a voting system may attempt to connect to that rogue base station that's broadcasting at higher power levels than other cell towers in the area. If that connection is successful, then the attacker may be able to inject malware, modify files, delete files, the things that I was mentioning earlier. Next slide. So how can we address these concerns? We certainly see the benefits of the network, the internet connectivity and these connections to external networks. We totally understand that it provides a way to rapidly send results, and we don't want to take that away. What we think here is that, yes, these devices may be connected to external networks, but they need to be physically isolated from the rest of the voting system. And that's what we mean when we say things like there needs to be an air gap. And that doesn't mean you have to go the sneakernet route or you have to drive the results or send information to a far location. It just means they have to be on two separate networks. So the devices could be within the same room as long as they are not communicating over the same network. And on the slide, I also describe some alternatives that I'll go over in the next few slides. E-pollbooks producing a physical token to activate the ballot on a device that's on a separate network, or the devices used for transmitting results over an external network must not be on the same network as the voting system. And I'll describe that a little better in these next few slides. Next slide. Okay. So as I mentioned here, for addressing the e-pollbook side use case and the concerns mentioned before, you need to insert air gaps to remove all of the direct connections that I mentioned before. So there's no direct connection between an e-pollbook and a ballot on demand device. You insert an air gap between an e-pollbook and a ballot on ballot marking device. And then finally, that an air gap between maybe a ballot on demand device that's communicating directly back to a voter registration database. So now those devices aren't connected. So now we have to figure out how to get that information from the e-pollbook or from the voter registration base to the ballot on demand device and the ballot marking device to make sure the voter gets the appropriate ballot. Next. And so now that we've created these two separate networks, this does not, if you'll notice from the diagram, this does not disrupt the e-pollbook's internet connectivity to receive updates from the voter registration database. Again, we understand that capability is necessary and that information needs to be updated. But here we show how to get the voter their correct ballot with the devices on the separate network. Next. So you can go ahead and press next 2 more times. So the e-pollbook could produce, e-pollbook or voter registration database could produce or print an activation token. And this activation token could be a code, say a number that, or alphanumeric number that says T7 to represent a specific ballot style, and that could be physically input into a system to get the correct ballot style, or the e-pollbook could print a QR code that encodes the ballot style, and that's then physically taken over to the ballot on demand device or ballot marking device. or place that same information on an activation card. Again, these activation tokens are then just carried over, scanned, and provided as input onto a ballot on demand device or ballot marking device. And it's keeping that separation from the, all of those devices on separate networks. Next slide. Now, to address those same concerns from the electronic transmission side, you again include an air gap by removing the scanner's or tabulator's connection to external networks or to the internet. And so we'll show an air gap there. Next. And so now one option is to insert a separate device on a separate network to actually handle that transmission of election results. Again, you'll see we still have that capability to transmit election results over the internet. It's just done on a separate device that's on a separate network from the scanner and tabulator. So again, this requires a means to transfer the information from the scanner or tabulator to the separate device to perform the actual transmission. And this could be done via a secure memory device or a barcode used to input the results into that separate device. Next. And next slide. And just once again, while we're going to the next slide, so we're not asking for an extensive process or for you to travel long distances because we certainly understand the geographical restrictions for some folks and things like that. This could be in the same room as the scanner or tabulator. The key is 2 separate networks and then some type of manual transfer of the data from the tabulator to the device that's sending the results. Sorry. And so finally here, to close out the external network communication section, we have the 2 requirements within the VVSG that go along with addressing those concerns. The first one being that the voting system must not be capable of establishing a connection to an external network or connecting to any device that is capable of establishing a connection to an external network. So those air gaps are what prevents this from happening, and then without including any capabilities within those voting systems to actually connect to the network. So the scanner or tabulator wouldn't have the cellular modem inside it. That would be outside of the voting system on a completely separate device. And then the second requirement there is secure configuration documentation. This requirement gives the vendor the opportunity to discuss how the voting system does not connect to any external networks, and then the alternative methods that are available to actually transfer data to other devices or other systems to do the ballot on demand printing or activate a ballot on a ballot marking device. Next slide. Any questions before we move on to internal wireless communications?
Gemma, this is Diane Golden, and maybe I'm just missing it, but nowhere in any of those schematics or anything did I see remote ballot delivery for an individual voter and how that could possibly work with an air gap.
That's correct, Diane. And I think we're going to cover remote ballot marking and remote ballot delivery after this discussion. Is that correct, Mary?
Well, I think we do have a few things to say about it, but let me just sort of push on this for a little bit, Diane. So you're talking about remote ballot delivery, not necessarily marking, or are you also interested in marking after it's delivered?
Well, they kind of go together, and I mean, anyway.
So it's really the whole
yeah.
enchilada that you're asking about, not so much the just the delivery.
Yeah, well, I mean, you got blank ballot delivery, you got online marking occasionally with some systems, and there's a variety. And then, of course, you got ballot return. But, I mean, again, the schematics that were up there, that all assumes there's an in-person connection. None of this is remote with the voter being remote. So that's the issue.
And in this particular case, the remote ballot would, when it's being delivered from where? From the election official's office? From their computer?
Well, that varies by how people do their remote ballot delivery.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of ties into the whole scoping, question of it appears from the definition, this is going to be in scope because there's nothing in that definition that says just because it's a remote something or other, it's not quote unquote part of the voting system. So I'm just trying to figure out how the bottom line is if whatever we're putting in the VVSG basically totally eliminates all remote ballot delivery, then we got a major access problem.
Ben, do you want to address this now, or shall we wait till later?
I can go either way. I think it depends on what you think as far as the remainder of the presentation.
Well, I think what's left here is wireless. How about if we hold on to that thought, and we'll come back to it after we go over the wireless, because I don't think wireless is going to take too awfully long, and I think we'll have time. And I do want to hear some from some of the election officials about how they actually implement remote ballot delivery as well. So I think it's a conversation that's going to take a little bit of time. Is that okay with you, Diane?
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions on the external communications?
Okay, great. Sounds like we can move on to internal wireless communications. Next slide. So for internal wireless communications, we've scoped this to these three use cases here. So peripheral input and output devices, and activation mechanism, and assistive technology. And I'll go into those three in just a moment. Next slide. So for those peripheral input and output devices, these are devices that would communicate with the voting system wirelessly. And once paired with the voting system, they could be used to input data, for example, a wireless keyboard or mouse, or output data, and that example would be a voting system communicating with a wireless printer to print something like a ballot. These peripheral devices could be provided by a voting system vendor, or they could be a COTS device or some device that may be brought into the polling place. If the voting system has this wireless capability, then it may be easy enough to pair any wireless device with the voting system. And the most common wireless technology that I'll go into a little more are Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but we'll also talk about one more later on. Next slide. All right, this next slide shows some possible configurations for how those peripheral devices communicate. And so here you will see a ballot marking device wirelessly communicating with a printer. Next, and that's via Wi-Fi. And then at the bottom, you'll also see a wireless keyboard and mouse, which could be hooked up to any part of the voting system. In this image here, it's wirelessly communicating with an EMS. Next, and those wireless keyboard and mouse usually communicate over Bluetooth. Next. The next use case is as wireless communication as an activation mechanism. So to activate a voter's ballot, the voting system needs the activation information from that e-poll book. That activation information may be stored in an activation card, and that activation card may communicate with a ballot marking device via a wireless technology. So, and that technology could be something like NFC, which is a short range, usually just tap it or hold it near a device to transfer information. Next. And one more next. So here we'll just show a card being held near a device. NFC is very short range, and so once that card is held near the device, you can just transfer the activation information. Next. And then this use case here is the assistive technology use case. Voting systems must allow voters to use their own personal assistive technologies, and these technologies may use wireless technologies to interact with the voting system. We definitely found that there are growing trends to using wireless technologies, such as Bluetooth headsets and also Bluetooth hearing aids. Next. And this diagram shows a ballot marking device wirelessly communicating with a Bluetooth headset or a Bluetooth hearing aid. Next, and this would require that Bluetooth marking device to have that Bluetooth wireless capability to be able to communicate back with those wireless headsets or hearing aids. Next. The slide here just shows a technology overview discussing, wireless, often known as the wireless local area networks, which are usually a group of devices wirelessly connected to a network that is restricted to a limited geographical area, which is different from external network communications, right? Because once you touch the internet, you have extensive reach. As I mentioned, nation-state attackers on this side. On that side, in this scenario, it would be a little more limited, and they would have to be in a bit of a closer range. Bluetooth is even shorter, also typically a low power wireless communication protocol, and that creates small wireless networks known as personal area networks. And then near field communication is even shorter range. So that is the shortest of the three described here, and it's typically less than 4 inches. Next. So what are the concerns with these different types of technology? So all of these devices wirelessly communicate over the air. So they're just broadcasting signals out into the air to communicate with different devices. And because that information is just out there, they could be vulnerable to interception. Wireless over-the-air communication creates a point of entry for attackers within that closer range that I mentioned. And similar to external network connections, we have those same concerns. But just at a closer range. And so this could be loss of confidentiality or integrity. If someone's just listening to the information that's being broadcasted, they may be able to intercept that information and actually use that access point to insert malware. Also, loss of availability. Because this information is just being broadcasted through signals over the air, it could potentially use a jammer to flood the various communication signals, so you can't use these various devices. Loss of ballot secrecy is very specific to the voter's ballot activation card. If that is compromised, for example, if someone holds something else near that, then they may be able to retrieve the information from the E-poll book that may be on that activation card, which could reveal some voter information. And then another concern is the lack of technical expertise that may be required to securely configure these technologies. And two things I want to touch on here is that, although the security of Wi-Fi has definitely improved over the years, I think it is dependent on proper setup and configuration. And while this could be this could be something that is allowed in the future. There hasn't been a heavy push or desire for these different Wi-Fi Wi-Fi capabilities that have been discussed here. So to be dependent on that proper secure configuration, I think we would want to steer towards preventing this additional entry point as much as possible. And then also Bluetooth does not have the same heightened security capabilities, and they are often dependent on the security that's already built into these Bluetooth devices. So you may not be able to configure the security settings of a Bluetooth device at a later date. They're usually set and set to minimum security, and we don't have much control of the security that might be built into a Bluetooth device and how that device interacts with another device. Next slide. And so how do we address those concerns? So certainly the first option is to only use physical wired connections. And so in that case, actually, I'll go into that a little bit more about what I mean by that. And by doing that, that would limit the attack surface by disabling the wireless communication capability within the voting system. So the voting system itself would not have any wireless capability built into it, so you wouldn't be able to access its network capability. Access its network capabilities, or it wouldn't be broadcasting, and it wouldn't be a potential point of entry for attackers. And lastly, I want to mention that this does not preclude the use of voters' personal assistive technologies within the polling place. So they would still be able to use their Bluetooth headsets, but in that case, they may leverage the headset by attaching an adapter, which I'll show later on. Next. All right, so what does that look like? Here, I have a diagram that shows how we would address these concerns. So if you remember the peripheral device diagram, it's showing these devices communicating wirelessly. Next. Well, we would remove that wireless capability from the voting system, like I mentioned. So there would be no wireless communication. Next, one more time. And one more time. And instead, there would be wired connections between devices such as the ballot marking device, maybe connecting directly to a printer to print a ballot, or an EMS physically connecting through a wired connection to a keyboard and mouse versus the previously described wireless communication. Next. And then as far as that NFC activation mechanism, next, instead we wouldn't use that wireless capability, and some other alternative would be used. Next. And one more time, next. Sorry, two more times maybe? No, that's it. So here I show some alternative mechanisms, which we talked about a little earlier. Well, maybe one being manual input of a code that's printed out from an e-poll book, or scanning of a barcode to take in the correct ballot style and provide the voter with their appropriate ballot. Next. And then for the assistive technology scenario, next. Again, the ballot marking device itself would not have the wireless capability. But in this diagram, it doesn't take away that wireless capability from the assistive technology. So the wireless hearing aid still has that Bluetooth capability, and the wireless headset is still showing the Bluetooth capability. Next. Alternatively, the voter could use the physically connected headphones that may be provided by a voting system vendor, or use the headphone jack adapter that I mentioned earlier and put in some type of Bluetooth receiver. This would would use the analog interface within the voting system to hear output from the voting system, and would also eliminate any need for the voter to have to pair their device with the ballot marking device. They would already be paired to their adapter, so it would just be an immediate connection and communication. Looks like there might be a question. Okay, and next slide. And so here I have the requirements that address those concerns and are relevant to addressing those concerns. The first one being the wireless communication restriction. So the voting system must not be capable of establishing wireless connections. And so as you saw in those diagrams, the components of the voting system did not have any wireless capabilities. So that means that any wireless capability within the voting system would have to be disabled, removed, however the voting system vendor decides to go about it. In 15.4b1, disable wireless secure configuration documentation, this is the documentation that would be provided to specifically say how that is done, how that wireless technology is disabled, is removed, is not able to be used to establish any wireless connections. And I think that is it. Next slide. Yep, that's it. Any questions there?
Dan Wallach here. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So one thing I'm interested in is the interaction of the definition of a voting system, which has a list of things that are and are not voting systems, and then these network considerations that bring up E-pollbooks and other things, which are not part of the definition of a voting system, but are communicating in some fashion, wirelessly, barcodely, whatever. And it seems that we either need to have some rule that talks about what is not allowed to talk to a voting system because it's on the outside. Otherwise, you are part of the voting system and you're regulated like one. So it seems that we have kind of two conflicting things going on here that I think we need to square somehow.
I think I can speak to that. Ben, if you could bring up John's last slide showing the definition of a voting system. Okay. So Dan, I'm gonna give an attempt to answer that. So at the particular point, for example, the E-pollbooks, based on this definition, the E-pollbooks themselves are out of scope. One, because of the requirement, but two, because the activate ballot for voters is done at the point when the barcode is received by the ballot on demand device or the ballot marking device. So those two are definitely devices that could be considered in scope because they activate the ballot. They are what's printing the ballot. But the actual E-pollbook themselves, the retrieving of that information, I think is outside. And then on the transmission side, the definition here stops at being able to, number 10, export the election data. And so that would be the scanner or tabulator either printing out that barcode to transfer the information or some kind of secure medium to send that information over, but it doesn't actually include how that information is transmitted to an election, the central account center or or state election center. And so that's how I've kind of used the definition as it is now to help scope the requirements. But I definitely see your point on the E-pollbook side about how that part could actually be included.
Right. I guess if we want to keep E-pollbooks out of the definition of a voting system, then there needs to be some notion of things outside the voting system dealing with things inside the voting system. And, you know, whatever rules we decide are appropriate, like maybe we say there's no wired network, there's no wireless network, and there's one-way barcodes. Whatever we decide that, you know, for what it means to deal with the inside to the outside and the outside back to the inside, it would apply to the E-pollbooks, it would apply to assistive devices, it would apply to many different things. So we need to be very careful about this.
Well, and Dan, this is Paul, and this is part of why I had a concern about how broad the definition for voting system was at the last call. So and I'll just use a real world example from my jurisdiction. So my E-pollbooks literally just generate a ticket that in an election day polling place is hand carried to a table where somebody tears a ballot off a pad of paper and gives them to you. So that E-pollbook has absolutely nothing to do with the voting system in that process, because it's just simply saying this is a valid voter and give them this ballot style. Ditto for my early voting sites, same poll book, except this time the printer is directly wired to the poll book and it generates a ballot on demand ballot. It doesn't use wireless technology to do that either. So my E-pollbooks in this scenario, under this definition of a voting system, are going to be out of scope. But if your E-pollbook is creating is encoding the card that the voter is going to take to the machine and insert directly, then maybe it starts to fall into scope.
So I think I would agree with that.
I would also say that your current configuration now, where you're printing on a ballot on demand printer, is part of that is in scope. So it's, I mean, your first scenario where you're generating code and you go and tear off the ballot, I think you're absolutely right. The E-pollbook is totally out. I mean, you've got a code, and the activation of the ballot is a low-tech solution. It's a human going over, pulling off the ballot and handing it to the voter. But when you're actually printing the ballot from the E-pollbook, there is the potential for disruption of, getting the wrong ballot, perhaps, the wrong, ballot style, perhaps the ballot itself even being changed if you have an E-pollbook that's also connected back to the internet and it's connected to your ballot on demand device. But an easy way to get around that is to separate them with an air gap and have a QR code generated or some other method to that your ballot on demand device would read in and then generate.
And
Does that make sense?
This is McDermott. There has been a lot of push that Colorado, for example, is not going to be allowing barcodes at all. So that's going to cause some problems.
Hey, Judd's not on the line.
And barcodes are just an example. I was referencing barcodes.
But it's the one that everybody's going to first. So that's clearly the most obvious solution, and it's not going to be. It doesn't seem to be a solution moving forward.
Right. I mean, what we're trying to do here is to ensure that if you're connected to the internet, if you have any components that are connected to the internet, whether it's your E-pollbook or your whatever device is doing your transmission, even though those connections might be very brief, you're still at risk. And what we're trying to do is to preserve everything that's on all the artifacts that are on the voting system. So your valid images, your cast vote records, all of your logs, to make sure that they're not going to be corrupted as a result of a connection to the internet.
Any other comments or clarifications on that matter?
Now, Dan, I don't think you've seen it, but in previous versions of the VVSG, and in fact, we've done a little bit of work on this one as well. We started to wordsmith it, but it wasn't quite complete, so we didn't send it out. But in the beginning of the VVSG, there is a section that talks about scope, where we're a bit clearer about what's in and what's out, and what does this mean, and provides a little more advice. So for instance, if in fact you're going to have an e-pollbook that's connected to the internet, you probably ought to have a firewall too, and points to a NIST recommendation on configuring firewalls. And so there is a little bit more that perhaps you're not thinking about, or were you thinking that there needed to be additional requirements?
I'm not sure what I'm thinking about yet, except to the extent that there's a subtlety here that we need to pick a side and be very clear what we want. That's all.
Okay.
Mary, this is Ben Hovland. I don't know if you think this is a good transition time back to the remote ballot access conversation, but I think I have a comment that sort of overlaps these two things.
I think it's the perfect time.
Great. So essentially, when I look at this, when HAVA was written, as far as I know, e-pollbooks weren't a thing. I think remote ballot access, I'm not aware if was a thing yet. Somebody might be able to tell me differently. But, so I think that's one of the challenges that we obviously face here. And for the most part, the history of the VVSG, as John walked us through, is primarily thinking about the machines in the polling place and then the machines that program those machines. And so, I think one of the pieces here is, as I had sort of outlined in the email that went around a while back about this call and sort of our timeline for voting to move forward into January, we have these very real issues on scope and important topics, talking about things like remote ballot access, talking about e-pollbooks. I mean, there are mental gymnastics to say e-pollbooks are not part of voting systems in many cases now, but, is that what we're allowed to cover in HAVA? Is that what has historically been covered? And I think those are different conversations that my suspicion is cannot be resolved by January. And so, I would leave it to you all to consider, the historical sort of definitions and scope of the VVSG and addressing the voting systems in the polling place and the machines that program those. Are we to a point where we can move forward or close to a point where we can move forward on that to start providing manufacturers, to kick off the process, just to reiterate, once the TGDC votes to go forward, then NIST will do some cleanup work. That will go to the EAC executive director. The EAC executive director will then forward that to the standards board and board of advisors. There will be a public comment period. There will be a public hearing, and then there will be those comments will be taken into consideration, and then ultimately there will be a vote. And so in a best case scenario, if the TGDC is able to move forward in January, we are still probably not talking about being able to have these requirements done until August or September. And so, and that I believe to be a best case scenario. And I float all that just to say, or to think about, you know, some of these other issues that are related. You know, I don't know if, I don't know if some of those need, I've seen legislation that floats, including E-pollbooks in federal certification. You know, I have heard both sides of whether or not that needs a legislative change. But I think subject matter like that, you know, talking about scope, you know, when we're talking about the remote ballot access issue, I think it really seems to depend how the system is configured. You know, there are probably ways to do that and completely or largely avoid any type of certified equipment, but then there might be other scenarios where you get into it. And so I guess what I would say, and maybe a challenge I would put out there for the TGDC to consider is, you know, these are important issues, but do they deserve sort of their own separate conversation to talk about what the future scope looks like? And again, you know, whether that is an administrative fix that we can implement, whether it's a legislative fix that we should demand or ask for, you know, I think those things should be put on the table, but I'm not sure that we will get to the answers in a timely fashion as far as it relates to the rest of this effort.
I think those are very fair points, Ben. This is Walt Copan speaking. And so I think that that we have the scope before us. That's very clear. That these are the actions that we know that that need to be taken now as part of VVSG 2.0. But also there's going to be a series of other action items that are identified for follow-on action, for clarification. And I don't think we need to wait for legislative action. I think there are certain elements that focus on what's practical in scope for the operations and the connections with the voting system that would come out of the deliberations of the TGDC follow-on activities that could be recommended then as part of our action plan for a version 2.1 or an update to 2.0.
This is Diane, and I not to be the wet blanket, but I'm setting aside the whole poll book issue, and that seems to be where most of the discussion is focused. I'm still back on the remote ballot delivery, remote ballot marking, however far it goes past delivery. I don't think that is something that you can just wait till later, because people are doing that, and if the new VVSG comes out and says no wireless, no internet, then there's going to be people immediately saying you have to stop doing that blank ballot delivery. Can't do that anymore over the internet.
Okay, so that's not really what we're saying. What we're saying is if you have external internet connections from these other election systems, so from E-pollbooks or the transmission, that they have to be air-gapped inside of, from the voting system itself.
Yep.
Okay, so we're not saying. I don't want people to think we're saying no internet, no wireless. Okay, but what we're saying is, if you're connected to the internet, we want to protect the voting system, so you have to have air gaps. And then inside the polling place, with respect to wireless, we just haven't seen a compelling use case. We've heard, okay, we need wireless printers. But we've also heard it's just as easy to run a cable. There's no, we don't really need, wireless for that. If there's a compelling use case, we can reconsider the security. But at this point, it's like, why would you take the chance? There's a chance that it's not going to be configured properly. There's multiple versions of security that almost all wireless devices support. So if you think you've got it configured properly and you're at the low end, guess what? You're probably not nearly as secure as you think you are. So, until we hear a compelling use case, I don't see a reason to change that. I think with respect to...
Yeah, have you all talked extensively to Maryland and all those folks who are doing remote ballot, delivery, marking, whatever, other than, literally loading a blank ballot onto a, flash drive and mailing it to someone. I am guessing it's not going to be that easy to do what you're talking about with this air gap stuff. I don't know that for sure.
That's not going to apply to remote ballot marking. I mean, it can't. I mean, if you think about the ways in which it can be done, it's either an application that's running on somebody's home system, or it's going to be a web service probably running on a county computer. So, I mean, by its very nature, you have to have networking capabilities, right? So but what we're looking at, what we're seeing is you've got remote ballot, regardless of which way it's implemented. In the end, what folks are doing is they're printing out a ballot. Okay, that ballot verification. I mean, if you're going to allow that, then that ballot verification, that onus has got to be on the voter to make sure that because you have no control over the security of their home systems. So there's nothing you can say about, is it secure? Are you running on a secure platform? Does it have any malware? Does it? I mean, you can't say anything about that. So your only real check has to be that voter has to know what a valid ballot looks like, and has to make sure that there hasn't been any changes. That might have resulted from an insecure platform. So there's just, and I think that's what we're struggling with. We recognize that there's large portions of the VVSG that would apply to any remote ballot marking application, because in essence it's a ballot marking device, right? If you take the device away. That there's large portions of it that apply. It's the security portions that apply to the underlying system that we're struggling with. And we're struggling with, okay, how would you even test and certify this?
And again, back to the definition of the voting system, if I email a blank ballot to a voter, that's not part of the voting system. They're returning that blank ballot back, or that voted ballot back to me, is not part of the voting system. Even if it's some form of electronic return comes in via email as an attachment, or there's a portal or whatever, those things aren't or shouldn't be connected to the voting system as it's defined. And that's why the definition of the voting system was tantamount to how we're trying to ratchet some of this other stuff down where there are real vulnerabilities that have to be addressed. That isn't to say that email is secure, right? I mean, anybody can stop an email along the way for the 100 servers it bounces through and do all kinds of things to it, and no sender or receiver, neither one knows. But there are things you can do to reduce the likelihood of that happening. But I mean, it's not part of the voting system. I could also still mail that voter a ballot.
That's correct.
This is Sachin, if I may jump in. My concern is if we hold off, and say we hold off to whatever you want to call it, 2.1 or whatever, the time it's taken to get us this far, and to think what it's going to take us to get to 2.1, I'm just skeptical how much time is going to lapse before we address this. I'm just not very confident it's going to be done in a timely manner.
Well, I think that, and this is Walter Copan, and I think that the approach that we put forward for provisional VVSG adoption process, as we look at these other connected issues, as we look at the security envelope that's going to be necessary, I believe that process itself will allow us to make rapid progress in between these versions to basically keep up as quickly as humanly possible with this team on the advances in technology that are going to be showing up in the polling place.
Yeah, and let me just remind you that the HAVA process starts with the TGDC. So it's really up to us. It's up to this group to prioritize what's next. So there's a number of issues that have been laid out today that could potentially be next. There's a lot that we can say about remote ballot marking already. But I do think it needs some additional research before it can be fully dealt with. So that's certainly one area. Electronic transmission. There's a lot of, Verizon is coming out with a new service that I know a number of you have heard about, where they say that the line that you go over is different, is separate from what the public goes over, and they're indicating that, hey, this might be a great way to handle communications for critical infrastructures. That needs more investigation, that and similar technologies from other companies, from other providers, before we can, these areas that I believe that we can take on. I think that they're within our scope for the TGDC, because the voting system, if you spend, I've spent a lot of time with HAVA lately, and the definition of a voting system is actually separate from where the TGDC, the activities of the TGDC are scoped. And, so I don't want you to think that we can't take it on because it's not within the VVSG definition of a voting system. So, so certainly electronic transmission, E-pollbooks, voter registration databases. I think all of these are possibilities for follow-on work.
And I think we need to view it in that way, that our goal here is to say that our next milestone is to be able to achieve what's practical and as secure as possible with guidance around air gaps in VVSG 2.0, together then with the process of continuing to advance the system in a dynamic technology development environment.
Hi, this is Bob Giles. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep, thanks, Bob.
Clear.
Yeah. So obviously I've been outspoken about my lack of confidence in the EAC getting stuff done. I mean, it's been 4 years since the last set of over 4 years since the last set of standards were put out. And those were just updates. We constantly ask for things from the EAC as far as legal opinions or, taking action on maybe provisional standards or, lack of quorum. So my concern is once we hand these off, I don't know how long it's going to be before we get another bite at the apple. And to me, it's more important to get it right than get it done. So this takes us a little bit longer to address these concerns. I think we have to take that time, because you're going to have jurisdictions doing this. And if we don't give some kind of guidance or set some kind of standards, going to have jurisdictions doing different things, and that is my concern. If we don't address it at this time, it'll be years before it gets addressed. So I think these are all—
This is Ben Hovland. I'm going to jump in here, Bob. Look, a couple things. One, on the remote ballot access point, obviously important, but I do want to clarify that even if it's not addressed here, it doesn't mean that people can't do it. It just means it's not part of the certified voting system, much like statewide voter registration databases. Those aren't part of the certified voting system, but most people are doing them. So I think that option is still there. But as far as the timeline piece goes, I am sensitive to the shortcomings of this agency and how we can do better than we have done historically. And as you know, I hope we do. But this body has been sitting on these requirements for a long time, in the sense of, and I know we're working through it, I'm on all these calls, but if these don't move forward, the nature of what HAVA says is that the TGDC starts the process. So to the degree that we want to have these things revisited, if the TGDC starts the process on revisions, and puts those on the table of the EAC executive director, then they are out there and it is a paper trail, and then we can be called on to move those. And so I think there's a big piece of this that is, we have got to move this ball forward now, or I believe that you should. And then to the degree that you're indicating that we may not have future opportunities, or there may not be future opportunities, that is determined by this body taking the action of doing, of revisiting the subjects that need to be revisited and pushing those forward. And I suggest that be considered.
I agree 100%, Ben. I think that that we can actually set the pace. We'll set the agenda for the technology questions that need to be addressed with regard to scope and performance. And really what the EAC needs is something to be able to take action on timely now, so that we can maintain then in the future this momentum that we're seeking to establish for the U.S. voting standards and guidelines.
And I can appreciate that, but I mean, you're kind of pushing back on us that we haven't given you the requirements. We gave you the standards, and you guys haven't voted on that yet. You haven't even put out the principles and guidelines yet. Yet you're saying we're holding up the process because we want to get it right, in my opinion. You don't have to agree with me that I don't look at it as stalling. I look at it as getting it right. So maybe you can let me know why the principles and guidelines have not been voted on. What's the delay there if you're going to say we're delaying them?
As you know, I'm happy to vote on the principles and guidelines. I think that I have made it abundantly clear, but if not, as you all know, we've been in desperate financial times. If this deal gets done, we will be getting more money, which is exciting. But you know that we operate with almost no staff. We have 20 people to run a federal agency, essentially. And while there have been delays, the reality was the principles and guidelines took 4 years to get here, and then at our September meeting, there was nitpicking about it, and there's still typos and grammatical errors in it. The reality is it's not a perfect process, and if we sit here and try to dot every I and cross every T, these things will never get done. And again, not that they shouldn't be right. First and foremost, they should be right. But I believe that there are processes that we can put in place to move forward, identify areas for revision, have those revisions in a timely process, and that would be more effective than simply running in circles while time passes by.
Well, I think the work that NIST just did over the preparing for this meeting was fantastic. I think what you guys presented today was very helpful in getting us to the next step. But we need to figure out what that next step is based on this. There was a lot of public comment concerning Wi-Fi and the use of it, and I just don't think we can kick that can down the road without really understanding what it is we're talking about when it comes to Wi-Fi or internet or Bluetooth. You've got all these terms floating around out there, and you've got all these technologies floating around there, and the disability community has to be addressed, and Diane's right. There are concerns. If it's written a certain way, somebody's going to take a hard line on that, and now you're going to potentially disenfranchise people because of that. So I don't think, and I know, and Ben, you and I have talked about this. I would love to see this get to the finish line, and we talked about trying to get it to the finish line by the spring, but it has to be right, and I get it. It's been a long time, but we were finished with the principles and guidelines roughly 2 years ago, and they're still not adopted. So I don't know, just saying because we're stalling that it's causing the delay when we don't even have principles and guidelines adopted. That should have been adopted. And I understand the challenges your agency has faced, but you did have an executive director, you did have an attorney at the time, and it got nowhere. So, and I don't want to fight about it. We work very well together, but we really need to recognize what has to happen here. And maybe we have some more of these meetings. We don't have to meet in person every time. I think a couple hours here, I think we really got through a lot of stuff today, and maybe have a what's the next step and have some more conference call meetings to get us to the finish line. So.
Well, I can tell you what we can do in remote ballot marking. And we have a couple areas to pull from. One, there was a series of publications on UOCAVA voters that are directly applicable to remote ballot marking in terms of security, in terms of identifying the security threats and that need to be considered. we can put out a guidance document pulling from portions of the VVSG and the those publications. What we cannot do, and you know, you could give me 10 years and $10 million, and I still don't think that I can secure, you know, home-based systems. So there is a very real challenge that if remote ballot marking is going to operate on somebody's home computer, I don't think there's any requirements that we can write that that could be, you know, that we can be assured would be upheld in that scenario.
Well, I think, Mary, you make a really great point. And so we know, on the other hand, that we have access to guidance, hopefully as a result of this process, and by January we can at least put a stake in the ground saying, here is something that's a good product that represents actionable standards and guidelines. And here is our set of recommendations, reference documents, and next steps regarding the technology environment in which we are working. And some of those actions are going to be relatively straightforward to accomplish. And to your point about home systems, some of those may take, you know, a significant time if we can, you know, ultimately crack the nut. But to me, I think to the point that Ben Hovland was making just a few moments ago, is by creating this process and the drumbeat that holds the EAC accountable for the next steps in response to what the TGDC delivers. And we will set those expectations ourselves for what we need to deliver as the TGDC, as well as the actions that we need the EAC to be considering on an ongoing basis. There's an old saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And so in search of perfection at this time, to be totally comprehensive, I think we all recognize is too challenging and will take a bit longer, but we can identify a roadmap, and that's what I'm striving for here, is to get a point, we have a stake in the ground with 2.0, and we have a roadmap and clear expectations established for the EAC for the future.
So this is Diane, and at the risk of being a really wet blanket yet again, I'm going to make a couple of points. So you got to recognize I'm coming at this from the accessibility perspective. I'm setting aside all of the security issues, but let me summarize what the current proposed 2.0 basically does for accessibility. The accessibility requirements in there are great. They've been tweaked and improved from the existing stuff. Are they going to be implemented tomorrow? It's going to take decades for equipment to actually come out that actually have those improved access features, in my opinion, but they're good. However, counteracting that is we now have software independence, a paper mandate, which is going to cause more jurisdictions to go back to hand-marked paper. We have no requirement for anything other than the HAVA one accessible machine per polling place, so we're going to probably increase the number of segregated accessible machines that don't work. We may be able to draft guidance to help address that. That's not regulatory. People are going to go the path of least resistance and most cost-effective, which is let's just print paper and have people hand mark it. Then we've now added an internet ban and a wireless ban that is not clearly scoped where they sit in those standards. So somebody's got to go back and look at the definition of voting system and maybe go back to someplace else to figure out that those bans don't exactly prohibit remote ballot delivery or remote ballot marking, et cetera. What I'm feeling is we have gone ahead 5 million steps for accessibility, and we have trampled all, or for security, and trampled all over accessibility in the process. That's what I don't want to see happen with this final 2.0 product. And everything that is really critical to advancing accessibility is over in guidance that's not mandatory or binding. You can tell the frustration in my voice, obviously.
So, I mean, we do, I should probably send around the scoping the intro portion that has the scoping information in it, where it does hopefully clearly indicate the networking scope, the transmission of unofficial election results, connections to e-pollbooks, and we have a section, I have it in front of me, that says some things about remote ballot marking, but since I haven't read it in the last couple of days, I'm kind of reluctant to tell you what it says. But there's at least an attempt there to indicate what this means for remote ballot marking. So how about if we clean that up and send it around to you all for feedback, and use that as a starting point, and then from that we can see, we can perhaps decide what the next steps are for January.
That sounds helpful. Do you think you could summarize what that will be trying to accomplish now? Is that feasible?
Well, yeah, I think in terms of the networking and the connections to e-pollbooks and transmission, Gemma has already presented what it's trying to accomplish. It's trying to isolate the voting systems from any external networks. So if you have external networks for e-pollbooks or external networks for transmission, then it's clearly saying they're outside the scope of the VVSG, and that the voting system itself has to be air-gapped from those systems. Right. That you probably want me to say what it says about remote ballot marking. Well, at the risk of you all jumping all over me, I'm just going to read what it says here. It's in fact, Ben, do you have it? Can you put it up or no? I'm not sure. Well, no, Ben will look for it while I'm reading it. Okay. Right now it says the property of software independence is met when a voter uses the remote electronic ballot marking application to produce a voter-verified paper ballot that can be delivered or mailed to the election authority. Likewise, it can be met if a voter's ballot selections are encoded in another format, like a barcode, as long as it's an auditable paper record is produced from the encoding that the voter can verify and cast. At the same time, if these remote ballot marking devices are connected to networks, certain restrictions will apply on how the applications may be implemented and configured. And then it says see section X.X.X. So I have to go back and find out what those sections are to really sort of speak, to what those restrictions might be.
Mary, so I heard from Diane a concern about the way accessibility requirements will be handled as part of VVSG 2.0. And I do agree we've made tremendous progress and provided great clarification. What are your comments in response on the accessibility piece?
Well, I think it's difficult. I think you're right, Diane. I mean, paper is not accessible, and with software independence today, I don't think tomorrow's technology will necessarily be this, but we are seeing a move towards more and more paper. So we're seeing inside, the polling place, we're beginning to see manufacturers to discuss ways for that paper to be fed back in and read back to the voters so they can verify. It'd be interesting to hear from you whether or not you think that's helpful, or is paper a no-go for you altogether?
I think I personally gave up the paper no-go battle when that just looked like a absolutely losing battle. The problem has been, 10 years later, it's people continuing to, pat us on the head and say, oh, but it can be made accessible, and yet it doesn't have it. The bottom line is it's not easy, it's not cheap, it's not efficient, it's not effective, it's cumbersome, it's expensive. Yes, it can be done, but it is not going to be a priority as long as all of this attention is on security instead. And we just always end up on the losing end of the stick. We're not the priority. We don't get the allocation of funds. There's another $425 million now for election security. Is there any damn money for accessibility? No. I mean, that's the world.
I share your frustration on the money front.
Yeah.
No, we hear you loud and clear, Diane.
I am not begrudging security at all. It's important. It's critical. The problem is every step you take to increase security basically screws accessibility. And that's the problem. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not like, let's put our priorities here and this just isn't a priority. It's literally the more attention you focus on security and increase the level of stringentness over there, you cause accessibility to go backward. And we just cannot get out of the way the fulcrum's been tilted for the last 10 years.
So the problem is not so much the isolation of the voting system inside the polling place from the external networks. Your fear, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that when we say if you connect to external networks, there is the potential for any type of an attack, that you're concerned that will also be applied to anyone who's trying to deliver a remote ballot marking application.
Yeah, and again, I'm not familiar enough with the way Maryland's system is set up or any of the other remote ballot, systems, how much of the delivery is network connected or not, et cetera. But again, if you throw up one more barrier to even doing remote ballot delivery or remote ballot marking, I mean, the answer comes, fine, I'll print it and mail it. Fine, I'll print it and mail it. I mean, that's where people are going to go because that's cheap and easy and doable.
Yep. Well, and I think that really,
like I said, historically, that's what's happened. I cannot, when I first started in this, working on voting stuff, which is not my thing, I mean, assistive tech is, when I first started working on this stuff, I can tell you the accessibility was better, believe it or not. Some of the access features were questionable, but we just simply have not made progress. If anything, we have gone backward over the last 10 to 15 years because of the return to paper, the isolated, segregated machine that is just going to become the status quo. I am afraid with the 2.0 collectively because it mandates paper. It has all of these heavy restrictions on anything digital. It's like digital is evil and digital is accessible. So there you go.
Well, Diane, I think that what we're really looking at is a roadmap for the future that includes our collective digital engagement and use of tools appropriately, securely, and I believe that is an important part of the roadmap that our documents that will be released with VVSG 2.0 will outline as the priorities that need to be addressed. And we realize that where we are today is far from ideal, and it certainly is not addressed fully in any stretch of the imagination. The accessibility and software independence matters. But we know that this is a pathway that we must be on for the future of a fully usable and transparent and modern election set of standards and guidelines. So we're with you 100% to look for that in the future. We just realize that we are not at a place now where all these priorities can be addressed at this moment.
Diane, Dave Wagner here. I wonder if there's two questions I could ask you about what it would take to move forward to address your concerns. So the first is, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, if I'm understanding you correctly, for the vision you're talking about to be feasible, it really requires not just the electronic ballot delivery and marking, but also the electronic ballot return. So I want to check and see if I understood that correctly. And then second, I wanted to check and see whether you thought there was any prospect for such systems with electronic ballot return being limited only to voters with accessibility needs. Can you share anything on either of those or both of those two?
truth be known, and clearly I'm speaking, for my own perspective and, the years I've spent doing this, and I certainly do not represent the totality of the disability community for sure. Honestly, for me, I'd be okay with either one of those. It's, full digital delivery, marking, verification and return would be just stupendous. But if we don't get there, if we're still remote delivery, remote marking to some extent, either home system or the online app interface somehow, and then you have to print it at the end of the day and mail it back in or hand carry it or whatever. I'm kind of okay with that at the moment, quite frankly. Is it fully accessible? No, but it's a whole lot better than nothing kind of thing. My concern, honestly, is just making it clear. Again, when small election folks are in the business of looking for a new voting system, and you've got an I'm taking this from the way it'll be portrayed in the news and in general, internet ban, wireless ban, paper mandate. I can tell you where they're going to go. They are not going to do anything but hand mark paper in a one ballot marking device in a, that's just where this is telling people is the way to go, because those are the big changes. And we, apparently we can't say, no, you can only do one segregated machine in a corner. That doesn't work. And we need to make it darn clear. And what Mary read was certainly helpful, and I wasn't seeing that, but it almost needs to be in the standards that say, the internet ban, this doesn't apply to, that's my concern. I'm not really trying to say we have to allow digital ballot delivery, marking, and return remotely. I'm not there. Like I said, it would be lovely to get there, but yeah.
What I read to you, Diana, is like the introduction. It would be in the introduction component of the standard. There's a section on scope.
Maybe we're closer than it seems then. I wonder if there's a way to address that by both being explicit somewhere that this allows and anticipates systems that involve the digital electronic ballot delivery and marking and then printing and return on paper, from a substantive perspective, and then from address the second concern about how this will be presented. I wonder if there's a way to formulate the statements of these bans or in the introduction or in the statement of the requirements to address the concern about how they'll be perceived. Just to kind of be very clear that this is something that is anticipated and allowed and not intended to be prohibited. And I don't know exactly how to achieve that, but I wonder if that might be achievable.
I think it is. It will likely be a bit of a compromise that basically points to a future roadmap that's digital and accessible, but recognizes the current reality of the threat environment and that the guidelines are intended to mitigate risk on behalf of the integrity of the U.S. election system. And so I think that working toward that end in the language of VVSG 2.0, our introductory sections that Mary was reading from and will continue to work on over the coming days, I think are intended to lay out more of the broad vision and how we see these things evolving over time, but also reflecting current reality.
So, this is what I have up here on the screen now as Ben was able to find the intro. But it has a section on networking, a picture that we probably need a little bit of work on, talks about the transmission of unofficial election results, connections to E-pollbooks, and then the section on remote ballot marking.
could I ask, and I just listened to the terminology mitigating risk, which is almost always used in reference to security concerns. Would it not be possible to also include a discussion somewhere in the introduction about mitigating risk for discrimination litigation, aka a segregated screen in the? I mean, I think that's what needs to be said. If you're gonna tell people there's these issues and you're mitigating risk, you need to also tell them that if you have one accessible machine in the corner, that is going to be seen as segregation and you're at risk for litigation.
Yeah, I don't think our introduction is going to be worded in those specific terms, Diane, but I do think that that being explicit about the importance of accessibility to this process is absolutely essential to highlight.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Diane, because I think we can point to the ongoing work on the guidance for having accessible devices inside of polling places. We can point to the changes in the VVSG where we're calling out specifically what's required by law, and we could point to remote ballot marking as well. As I mentioned before, there are a couple of NIST publications we could also point to that would, that consider some of this, or we could pull it together in a separate publication that would more fully discuss remote ballot marking. And, because I do think there's a large portion of the VVSG that applies. I mean, it's not just the usability and accessibility components, but certainly, ensuring that the application works properly, that it supports the voting variations that it needs to, that it's free of vulnerabilities, and there's quite a number of sections that would apply, in addition to, what you might need to be concerned about if you're building an application.
This is Sharon Laskowski. Can I add to the mitigating risk?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, so I think we can also mention that we also want to mitigate risk to voters who do need the electronic interface.
Yep.
So it's not just litigation, but it's also mitigating risk of errors that people who have low literacy, for example, and others that can benefit from the accessible ballot marking, and point out that as designs evolve, we get better at helping voters understand that they need to verify their ballot before they cast it, if they're doing that electronically.
I think those are very, very important points to incorporate, Sharon. Thanks for those additions. Are there other comments that would be helpful in kind of fleshing out our action plans for the document as well as any support materials?
This is Ben Hovland again. I just sort of wanted to reiterate some of what Mary highlighted earlier, but again, I think this conversation and what we are focused on in the moment is the VVSG requirements, which, as we know, are a pretty specific thing with a pretty specific scope, as we have discussed today. But as Mary mentioned, when you look at HAVA, when you look at the TGDC section of it, it talks about what the TGDC does, it talks about what NIST does, and it talks about a broader scope where, it says that NIST and the TGDC, can look at things like the security of computers, computer networks, computer data storage used in voting systems. These are things that have, been outside of the VVSG, but are hugely important to elections and election administration. And so, it goes on, but I certainly think that there is a broad mission that I hope the TGDC and our partners at NIST will take on. And I think we can do that. I think that, I will say my read of the situation is we are trying to solve all of the problems of the world when we need to solve these problems first and then move on to, again, not to be insensitive to those, but I just think that they are described in a different section of HAVA. And so I hope that we're able to do all of those things.
Great. Ben, thanks so much. This is Walt Copan once again. You can see me in the little box there. One of the things I wanted to make sure that we covered today was any sort of remaining comments on the recommendations for the provisional VVSG adoption process, as well as for transparent public comment review. And so let me just open up the floor for any comments on those documents that you've received in advance.
Hi, this is Bob Giles. Ben, have you talked to your other commissioners? Is there an appetite for this provisional process?
We have not had extensive conversation on it, but I think that it is, I will say that I feel like it has a more likely pathway to success than get all that, Bob? I don't know who or what that was, but no, I think that I think there's a piece of it that makes a lot of sense and is worth considering.
So Ben, your sense is that there would be appetite, and as they understand it, there would be potentially good support from the commission, the other commissioners on the provisional process.
I don't know if there's someone we need to mute. I would say I'm not in a position to speak for anyone other than myself, but I think that it is a process that I could see being more likely to gain support than some others that I have heard historically.
Yeah, and so I think that having a preamble to the provisional process helps those who are perhaps not familiar with its use in the standards context. Very good. Any other comments on these remaining topics in our agenda? We're getting a fair amount of
Hi, sorry, this is Mary Saunders. Can you hear me?
Barely.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It's okay. Just a brief comment on the comment period. This is the second document, the recommendation for a transparent public comment review process. And I can send these in writing. It's just it says all comments must be posted on a public website. Generally, agencies do review comments briefly before they're posted just to ensure that the content is relevant to the item. Is that something we need to call out explicitly?
But yes, I think that's a good point.
Yep.
I'll send something in writing.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Mary. Any other comments on these? About the technical issues that we're having with background noise. Do we have a target date for meeting? And secondly, do we have a target date of an updated VVSG 2.0 as well as these I don't know if anybody could hear me. having
I could
a
hear
massive...
you.
I just back. So as far as target dates for follow-up documents, then VVSG 2.0, Mary, can I just ask you for a suggestion?
I think a large part of the team is out for the rest of the year.
Sure.
So,
and so perhaps as a follow-up to
Excuse me real quick. This is Jerome. If you're not speaking, will you please use your phone? We're trying to manage that on our end as well, but if you're not speaking, will you just please use your phone?
Thank you. Appreciate that, Jerome. And so we'll then plan to provide the update from our meeting today, target date for document delivery, and then look to a meeting then later in January for reconvening the TGDC.
now I'm pretty certain, see, what is the NASED meeting? The GCC and NASED meeting is probably late January? '30th?
Yes.
Okay. So we would look then to propose a date prior to then to gather together.
Well, earlier that week is probably the GCC meeting, is my guess.
Right.
But there's normally that whole week prior, the meetings are booked.
Sure.
Bob, do you know anything yet about that, the week prior to NASED? Are there a number of meetings already booked?
Bob may be on mute.
This is Ben Hovland. I will say that I know from our last round of emails discussing the potential of a January meeting, I did get a certain amount of responses indicating that between NAS, NASED, JULC, et cetera, that January was potentially going to be tough for an in-person meeting. I think that it's worth, I will start a chain and maybe we can discuss where people are to see if what, again, the path forward is. You know, is there a need for an in-person at this point? Do people feel like there are small things that can be addressed that could get us to a phone vote potentially, if that's possible? Again, I would reiterate the timeline for the other boards to, as I said in the email, realistically, the other board meetings, the Standards Board and Board of Advisors, are going to be in April. My understanding of the process is that it takes NIST about 30 days on cleanup. And so in order to give them, 30 to 45 days to review before their board meetings, realistically, we need this to be done in January, or we would have to look for alternatives to convene them. As you all know, convening this 15-member board is a challenge at times, but certainly easier than the 110-member Standards Board. So I just flag that for your awareness on timelines and challenges.
Hi, it's Bob. Sorry about that. I was being a good team member and I had muted myself.
Thanks, Bob.
So the 30th we have GCC, and then there's an executive TTX, and then NASED runs through Sunday, and then I think the ERIC board meets on Monday. So, that's quite a bit of time out of the office. And I think the phone calls have worked out really well. This way, if one or two people can't make it, we're, like over the summer when we couldn't get everybody together, I think we lost a lot of time, kind of waiting to have that in-person meeting. So I I personally like the phone calls, and then maybe when we finally get to that finish line, we could do in person if we need to.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so, Ben, we'll look for you then to kick off an email chain to kind of finalize our planning for at least a call in January to follow the issuance of the next round of documents.
Okay, and the action item for the next time is really a focus on remote ballot marking and improving the introductory or improving some portion of the VVSG to call out accessibility and ways to improve accessibility.
Right. We also talked about having perhaps just a brief preamble to the Resolution 3, the provisional VVSG adoption process, so that those who are unfamiliar with why a provisional process is important would have that background. And then Mary Saunders said that she was going to be providing recommended language for the public comment review. Those are the actions that I'm aware of. And of course, the great work of the team. I just want to say thanks to each of you for your commitment to this important process. We know that this is a journey for the nation. That's a very important one. And recognizing that it's an ongoing journey as technologies evolve. And with the passionate comments that we heard in our meeting today, we recognize that there are many dimensions that need to be dealt with timely. Some will be able to do now, and others will be part of the roadmap for the future of the TGDC. So if there are any other comments that need to be shared for the good of the order, let me just open that up now to the group. Hearing none, let me say thanks again. Ben Hovland, I know, have been just so pleased with the strong workings of this team and the great contributions made by all of our colleagues and the NIST team in the benchmarking and the drafting work that's been done. So thanks to each of you. Have a great holiday, and believe me, we're going to be in touch soon.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.